Hello, my name is Father Timothy Tighe, and this is our 64th segment of our journey of faith in the light of the cross. Thank you for joining us. And we go to our screen and we see in this section of Mark's Gospel, chapter 6, 5 loaves feed 5,000 Jews, and 12 baskets are left over on the east side of the Sea of Galilee. 7 loaves feed 4,000 Gentiles, and 7 baskets left over. There's plenty. Both trips show both sides satisfied by the one bread of Jesus. Now we go to our next screen and we see Jesus said as he looked out on a Jewish crowd, as we continue from last segment, "I have pity on them, for they have no shepherd." Jesus has come because the shepherds of Israel are inadequate, as we all are. Disciples said, "It's late in the desert wilderness. Send the poor people home to eat." He said, "You feed them." It's very interesting. He had taught them, and now it seems natural for them family. They have a family atmosphere that they should eat together. And Jesus says, "You feed them to the disciples." They said it would cost 200 denarii. You see, they're too practical. They don't understand God is helping them. He said, "How many loaves have you?" They said, 5 loaves and 2 fish. Now we go on to the next screen. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, Jesus surrendered himself. He looked up to heaven. He was free from all limits and boundaries of this world to surrender himself up to God. And he blessed and broke them and gave them to the disciples. And he says, "Now you give it to the people." He didn't want to feed the people directly. He says, "You can do it. You can satisfy their needs." All ate and were satisfied. They were more than satisfied. 12 baskets of fragments were left over, and they all felt good because they had been taught, and now they celebrated by sharing as one family of Jesus. 5,000 men ate the bread. Now, as soon as this happens, at once, Jesus ordered the disciples into boats. They got into the boats, they go out. He went to pray. Now we go to our next screen and we see, at dusk, as sunset, he saw they were upset, rowing against a contrary wind. The word contrary is good because it's not only outside, it's inside. It's an adverse, strong wind outside, but inside they're upset. He came walking on the sea, intending to go on ahead of them to the other side. They saw him walking on the sea and thought it was a fantasy. They often translate the word ghost, but it really is a phantasm from which we get the word fantasy. I like that. They were troubled, the disciples. What does he expect us to do? He's like you and I. I can't handle all this, Lord. He said, "Take courage, it is I." Ego eimi is the Greek translation of "it is I," and it's the translation of the Hebrew Yahweh, God's name. So every time he says this, they can hear, if they have faith, it's God speaking. And he says, "Be not afraid. I am with you. We can handle all this. You are adequate." We go on to our next screen. He got into the boat and the wind ceased, but the wind inside them ceased, which was more important. They were amazed, for they did not understand about the loaves, for their hearts were hardened. What does this mean? They couldn't open themselves to receive what Jesus was doing from heaven. They were too yoked to the Mosaic culture. All of us are too yoked to our culture and the education we receive and the limits and boundaries which prevent us from allowing us to share in the fullness of life of Jesus, the limitless life and boundless love. We go on to our next screen. On landing on the other side, the Pharisees and scribes saw the disciples eating bread with unclean hands and questioned Jesus. They were upset. All their lives they feel inadequate. They see this man doing what they thought they could never do, and they feel out of control, and they say, "But we can control this." They didn't wash their hands. They become small-minded, and they worry about hands being washed instead of saying, "Isn't it wonderful? God's people are being fed and nourished." He said, Isaiah was right about you hypocrites. You let go of God's commandments and you hold on to the traditions of men. We go to our next screen. And it says there in Tyre. So he leaves there and he goes up the Mediterranean coast to Lebanon. And in the city of Tyre, which is a Lebanese Gentile city, a Syrophoenician woman asked him to free her daughter of a demon. Again, we see just as Jairus brought his daughter to Jesus, the synagogue official, in the Jewish side, this woman brings her daughter. He said, permit first the children to be satisfied. I come first for the children of Israel, and this children, techna, means disciples of, grown people who are sort of disciples of a philosopher or a teacher. It really isn't a good translation in English. Not good to throw the children's, the techna's bread to dogs. Dogs is the word that the Jews use toward the Gentiles. And this woman loves her daughter so much, she ignores it. She says, even dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. And she says, isn't that wonderful? Here she loves her daughter so much. No Israeli or Jewish mother or father could love their child more than this child, that she could ignore the abuse and put her faith in Jesus and said, if you can heal my daughter, please do it. He says, go home by your word. Your daughter has been healed. But the daughter here, the children's crumbs, is Paida, which means blood daughter, blood sons and daughters. That's the true word for children. We go on to the next screen now, and we see they continue traveling across the northern part of Israel, and they go north of the Sea of Galilee, and they go down the Gentile side in the Decapolis, which means the 10 cities on the far side of the Sea of Galilee. They brought him a deaf and dumb man. He said, Ephphatha, be opened, and he healed him. They said he does all things well. He makes the deaf to hear and the dumb to speak. Now what he's doing is an exorcism, not just of this one man, but of all the Gentiles. The Jews assumed Gentiles could not hear God's word nor speak it because they were so full of the darkness of sin. Jesus liberates them now to receive his word and to share it with one another. So he's preparing now for feeding the Gentiles. We go on to the next screen. A great crowd came. So Jesus comes for the great crowd, which the leaders of this world cannot cope with. He taught them. Then Jesus said, I have pity on them as I have pity on the Jews. The disciples said, who can satisfy so many in this desert? How can you meet their needs? How many loaves have you? He said again. They said 7, the eternal number, the universal number. Taking the 7 loaves, he blessed them, he broke them, and gave them to the disciples to serve the crowd. Again, he says, I want you to serve them, to feed them, to show that you can do it. We go on to the next screen. They ate, and they were satisfied, the Gentiles. This is what they have been longing for too. And 7 baskets of fragments were left over because there was more than enough. And there were 7 baskets symbolizing the universal banquet of all people. About 4,000 ate. And again, at once, he got into the boat with the disciples and went back to the other side. And immediately he meets resistance. The Pharisees are just like the disciples. Pharisees ask for heavenly sign. Jesus groans and he refuses. Now we go on to our next screen. The disciples forgot bread when they got into the boat. It was simple. They only had 1 loaf with them in the boat. Now, Jesus was warning them about something else, but they make a connection that's not there. Beware of the leaven, the yeast. What does leaven and yeast do in flour? It corrupts it, it breaks it down and causes a process that raises it. And that's why they eat unleavened bread. It's free from the corruption of leaven or yeast. And that's why at Mass we use unleavened bread. It's incorruptible bread. Beware of the leaven, the corruption in the teaching of the bread of the Pharisees. They said, is it because we have no bread? Jesus says, do you still not understand? Are your hearts still hardened? And we go to our last screen, and he says there, when I broke 5 loaves for 5,000, how many baskets were left? They said 12, there was more than enough. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many baskets were left? They said 7, more than enough. Do you still not understand? And Mark is saying that to you and I and the leadership of the church today. Do you not understand that Jesus satisfies the needs of all people? Thank you for joining us, and I hope you join us for segment 65.